want to thank you so much for inviting me to Atlanta to speak to you. It's my pleasure. I flew in this morning, and it looked like you might get a little rain, but then I found out that you really didn't, and I hear you need it badly, so I'll pray for rain. Now, when you do what I do, which is write narrative history, which is nonfiction, you are essentially embarking on a long treasure hunt for facts, for new information, for diaries, for documents, for stories that have never been told before, or stories that were told and forgotten and lost, or people that never told their story before, and you get to them one last time before they too are lost. Writing about spies, however, is a particularly tricky business, I discovered. The history of any great espionage undertaking is always elusive, and this is by definition because of their secret doings. They're full of shadowy characters and murky events, and it makes them much more difficult to unearth the true accounts, to find documents. Stories are hushed up. But in this case of the story of the Irregulars, of this particular group of secret British spies, it was much more difficult. Almost all of the official accounts were muddled by exaggeration, misdirection, and lies, both official and unofficial. So the history of the British operations in America during World War II are among the most controversial in the war. I was reminded when I was working on this book constantly of a line in one of my favorite westerns, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. And in that movie, the Jimmy Stewart character asks the editor, you know, is the truth about what happened here ever going to come out? And the newspaper editor looks at him and sighs and says, "No, sir, this is the West, and when the legend becomes fact, print the legend." Well, it seemed to me in reading over intelligence reports and intelligence books that were written after World War II, it's pretty much the same. A certain false glamour attaches itself to wartime exploits, and a certain glossy version of facts emerge, a sort of a sanctioned version, and then people stick to it for decades afterwards, and any inconvenient facts are swept under the rug. Now, in the case of this particular group of spies, this was a black book group of spies. That means it was a covert operation, and in this case, particularly covert because nobody wanted to own up to the fact that they were there. So the whole idea was if they were caught, you know, the Secret Service in Britain would say, well, they're not our boys, and nobody would be to blame. Now, their boss, William Stevenson, was hired by Churchill in 1940, and Churchill at that point wanted to take a really desperate action. He needed to turn American public opinion in favor of the war, in favor of intervening on England's behalf. What most people forget is at that point, World War II hadn't really begun yet for America. We were sitting on the sidelines. We were overwhelmingly isolationist. In the newspapers, it was still referred to as the quote-unquote European conflict. Well over 98% of this country was adamantly opposed to any intervention whatsoever. You know, we had pulled England's chestnuts out of the fire in the last war. They hadn't paid all their war debts. Now they were in dire straits again, and they wanted our help, and most Americans just didn't want to get involved. They didn't want to send our boys over again to help the Europeans clean up yet another mess. So strong were the feelings opposed to intervention in this country that Roosevelt, who had a friendship with Churchill, was very sympathetic to the situation of the cities in Britain being bombed and blitzed and to the damage, wanted to help, was advised that if he did so much as vote any kind of funds, even food and money, he might risk his chances of re-election. In 1940, the Lend-Lease Bill, which was, again, it wasn't a military aid so much as money and support, it barely passed Congress. And so the British sent over these spies. They were really old-fashioned intelligence agents to do propaganda to try and turn American public opinion towards Britain. And the head of this group, which was called the British Security Coordination, that very clumsy title was given by J. Edgar Hoover, who was head of the FBI. He didn't think much of this idea. He knew enough even then to sense that any interloping group would just cut into his own power, his own domain, and he was opposed to it. But Roosevelt instructed him to look the other way, sort of a wink and a nod, that they would come in, They would root out Nazi sympathizers. They would expose any Nazi plots or people working with the Third Reich in this country, and they would help sort of ease our way into helping Britain in the only way he felt that we could at that time. It was a great risk, of course. Had Congress or the public been aware what he did, it would have been seen as treasonous. It was in violation of the Monroe Doctrine. And in some sense, he risked impeachment in what he was doing in letting foreign spies run rampant on U.S. soil. But he felt very strongly about it. And so William Stevenson arrived. William Stevenson was famous after the war for his code name Intrepid. But William Stevenson was a particularly slippery character. And he's made this history even more difficult by commissioning, before he left in 1945, all of his own official reports, so that the actual documents that exist that theoretically describe what this group of spies did were written by his own spies. They were written by his closest lieutenants, and they were written by the ones he thought were the best writers, and one of them was Roald Dahl. So in fact, the actual history of this period, that is the classified British document covering the activities of the British Security Coordination from 1940 to 1945, one or two chapters are actually written by Roald Dahl, though they're not signed. So this makes this history particularly fraught, because if you are reading an official history that has been commissioned by the man that was in charge of the activities and it's been written by his lieutenants, you can imagine how unbiased it is. It makes today's media look positively cherubic. So in trying to sort out the truth of what the British spies were really up to in Washington, I had all kinds of difficulties, not least of which was that I was hampered by the fact that intelligence agents themselves are, how should I put this diplomatically? I don't want to say born liars. Let's say gifted liars. They are hired because they have a certain facility with the truth. They're imaginative. They're quick on their feet. They're clever. And then they're trained in the arts of obfuscation and deception and manipulation for years. So you can imagine that when they start giving interviews after the war, that you would be naive to take absolutely anything they say at face value. So people who write about this, and there are many, there's a 5-foot shelf of books, and not one of them agree. In fact, one of the best books written about this period was written by OSS and CIA historian Thomas Troy, and it's essentially a series of footnotes just correcting and giving both sides, and sometimes 3 sides, to every controversy about this period. So this is a period in which it's very, what do you call it, loose sand shifting under your feet, and it's very difficult to know what's true. In doing this book, I left out many of the more controversial episodes. The Irregulars were accused of assassinating an isolationist senator in Texas. They were accused of mounting all kinds of escapades and code-breaking things. Many of those are disputed. Some people claim that they're wildly exaggerated. Other people claim that Americans know them to be true and have hushed it up. There are both sides of the argument. I stuck to what I could safely call fact by triangulating diaries and records which I unearthed. I was very lucky in the course of doing this book. You feel kind of like those high plains people that move to the prairie and walk around with a divining stick looking for water. You look around, you're looking for diaries and records that no one has found before. And I'd been working on this book for about 1.5 years when I got a call from a family that said, you know how you called us 1.5 years ago and said you thought there was correspondence between this American publishing tycoon, Charles Marsh, and Roald Dahl, and we told you it was lost? Well, someone retired, a retainer who had been running this man's fortune for 25 years, retired, and he cleaned out of his office in Washington, D.C., and he moved a filing cabinet and found 2 or 3 cardboard boxes full of diaries and records and documents. It contained a full account of Roald Dahl's activities during the war, and the family was kind enough to give me copyright of the material for this book. So many of the documents in this book have never been published before, and it was funny, when the book came out last week, it made big news in England because while we think of spies like Roald Dahl and Ian Fleming, we think of them in being like Fleming's post-war creation James Bond, you know, parachuting behind enemy lines under the cover of darkness. Roald Dahl and Ian Fleming, you know, they were really desk jockeys, so reality sort of falls a little short of fiction there. It wasn't quite as glamorous as that, though Roald Dahl did quite a lot of his work at night between the sheets. And the British Fleet Street Press naturally seized on this, and a great number of articles ran in the British papers last week with headlines like "Sleeping with the Enemy." But I don't want to give everything away here, so I won't tell you more about that. Anyway, so these were not Bond-like action heroes so much as I said before, old-fashioned intelligence agents. Intelligence gathering is a much less dangerous business, but it's every bit as important, in some ways more important, and the British were incredibly effective at it. Their job was to go around and find dirt and information about U.S. officials and politicians, and they forwarded it back to their bosses in England with an eye to using it in a way that would be favorable in manipulating American domestic and foreign policy. They were extremely good at it, and history judges the British Security Coordination, that is the activities of the Irregulars during the war, as probably one of the most effective counter-espionage rings in the annals of espionage. It's interesting to know that most of the spies that were hired by William Stevenson to work in this ring in America were not actually formally trained as spies. And they were all amateur spies, gentlemen spies, we often call them now, though they were very ungentlemanly arts. The reason for this was simple enough. England, which had a very distinguished and old intelligence community, those spies, the formally trained spies that had come up through the Secret Intelligence Service, we think of it as MI6 and MI5 today, they were already busy. They were busy tracking troop movements, U-2 submarine movements, cracking the Enigma code in Bletchley Park. They were extremely occupied already in the more older and established departments of the Secret Intelligence Service. So when Stevenson was sent over to America to establish this spy ring, he really had to find help where he could. You called friends sisters to be stenographers and secretaries, and it was sort of done through people who went to school together. It was like voting in members of a club. If somebody said they were good enough, you did a cursory check and you took them in. It was a very hurried business, but it worked remarkably well. And the Irregulars were hired not so much, as I said, for any training they had in espionage, but for a certain cleverness they had, a certain wit, a certain charm. They were handsome. They could make their way easily in the world, and often for their social connections. In the case of Stevenson, he was looking for people that were already in America, who had a likely cover story, and who were well connected, and they could use those connections to begin spying for Britain in a way that would not make them easily detectable. Now, Dahl was an accidental spy. He only became a spy because he was a very young green RAF pilot, and he was in the Syrian campaign, and his entire unit was killed. In those days, British pilots went down in huge numbers. Their planes were not as good as the established German Messerschmitts. They were vastly outnumbered, and his entire first unit was killed, and 5 of them were flown off a small Greek island to safety. And he was transferred to another unit. He was given bad directions and a plane he'd never flown before. He got lost and crashed in the Syrian desert, and it was a very bad crash, and he was lucky not to burn to death. But at 25, he was invalided out of the war, and it was awfully early, 1941. All of his friends were still fighting, and so he was looking for something to do, some other way to serve his country. He did not want to be one of those so-called whiskey warriors, back home drinking and partying through the war. So when he got an assignment to go to America, he took it. Now, he got here, and he was dismayed at what his job turned out to be. He was terribly good-looking, Roald Dahl. He was Norwegian by birth. He was 6'6". He was incredibly handsome and absolutely smashing looking in his RAF uniform and gold braid. And it turned out that what they wanted him to be was sort of a poster boy for Great Britain. He was supposed to kiss babies and flirt with congressmen's wives and try to raise money for their war widows and orphans back home, and sort of a goodwill ambassador. And he said he found himself trapped in the so-called Washington cocktail mob and was appalled at the job. And he was so rude and so sarcastic and so mischievous that he got fired. He was about to be sent back to England when Stevenson decided to intervene. He'd come to the attention of British intelligence, and Stevenson decided it was worth trying to see if this fellow could be turned into a spy. He would later say that one of the reasons he considered doing it was he thought that no one that badly behaved would ever be suspected of being an agent. When Dahl got hired, he quickly discovered who his colleagues would be. His colleagues were a motley crew. Stevenson hired, as I said before, everyone he could find. He hired actors like Leslie Howard. Leslie Howard, one of the stars of Gone with the Wind, was actually shot down by the Germans when he was ferrying a message for Stevenson. Noel Coward, the playwright and songwriter, was an agent for the Irregulars. Roald Dahl's first roommate in Georgetown when he went to work for Stevenson was David Ogilvy. This was a young David Ogilvy who would later become the founder of Ogilvy and Mather, the giant advertising firm. David Ogilvy was a little bit too old to be drafted into the war, and he had been working in this country in advertising and then had gotten a job at the Gallup Poll Organization. Now, this was very intriguing to the British. The Gallup Poll Organization, then as now, did all the election polls. Well, the British were obsessed with Roosevelt staying in office. You know, we forget now that Roosevelt was very controversial in the 1940s. He was as loathed every bit as much as he was loved. And when he ran for an unprecedented third term, it was a matter of enormous controversy. You know, the anti-New Deal crowd could not wait to get him out and, you know, accused him of establishing a dynasty and being a monarch and all these things. And it was a very heated election. That said, when he ran for a fourth term, it was even worse. So the British were absolutely obsessed with Roosevelt's popularity, his Republican opponents, who was up and who was down. It makes sort of CNN look positively languid by standards. If you read these memos that fired back and forth daily between New York and London, Churchill was absolutely mad for any news about Roosevelt. Now, the other thing was, it was very underreported in this country, but Roosevelt was very frail. And in fact, in the early 40s, his health really started to fail very dramatically. He got very thin. He got very haggard looking, so much so, in fact, that they dared not even have him appear in 1944 at the convention because he really didn't look well. And so they came up with a cover story that he had to go inspect some naval ships in the Pacific, and he skipped the Republican convention in the Democratic convention in Chicago in 1944 because they thought that his appearance would shock people. So the British were, you know, hung on every Gallup poll. And in fact, they did a little bit more than that because they infiltrated Gallup with David Ogilvy, who was a senior executive there, very close to George Gallup. They got inside information. George Gallup was a Republican. He was not only a Republican, but he was a huge and fervent Wendell Willkie supporter. So during the third election, Willkie was calling Gallup up every day and trying to get Gallup to release polls that made Willkie look good and look like the Republicans had an edge. And the British knew this, and not only did they know this, but they kept their own polls. And documents show that the election polls that the British Irregulars did under David Ogilvy were more accurate than the Gallup poll for the 1944 election. So good was the British information about what was really going on. Now, many people ask, well, what did they accomplish with all of this manipulating of politicians, manipulating of public opinion, monitoring of polls? Well, one thing that they take credit for, and some people might dispute this, but certainly they worked very hard behind the scenes, was in ousting Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace was vice president during Roosevelt's third term. He was an agricultural hero in the Midwest. He had rebuilt the agriculture department. He was adored by the farmers, but he was very, very left-wing. He was called the prophet of the common man, and the British decided that he was nothing but a communist. They couldn't bear him. He was virulently anti-empire, and every time he could, he got up and gave a speech about how the people of India should be freed and talked about the atrocities that Churchill was committing in the colonies. Every time they drafted a bill or had any kind of legislation before Congress, he wanted to attach to it that the people of the various British commonwealths should get their independence. So he was at the very, very top of Churchill's enemies list. And the British decided that when Roosevelt ran for a fourth term, that they could not afford to have Henry Wallace remain on the ticket as vice president. The British felt that it was very unlikely that Roosevelt would survive his fourth term. They couldn't afford having Henry Wallace, who was so anti-empire, as president of the United States. So they mounted a huge behind-the-scenes campaign to put pressure on the Roosevelt administration to oust Henry Wallace. They also used all of their contacts in the press. Roald Dahl's particular job was to manipulate and court the American press, and he had formed very, very close relationships with Walter Winchell and Drew Pearson. And for those that don't remember, they were not only the premier gossip columnists of the time, but they went way beyond gossip columnists as we think of them now. It was wartime. They printed all kinds of Washington gossip, of State Department gossip, gossip about politicians. They also had, they were syndicated in 800 to 1,000 newspapers, if you can imagine. We have nothing on a scale like that today. And they also had radio programs that were hugely popular and listened to by everyone. So they were just incredibly powerful. Well, Roald Dahl cultivated friendships with both of them, and both of them were very pro-British. Both Pearson and Winchell believed that the country should be involved in the war before it was, and then after we entered the war, were very pro-British. And they readily traded items with him. And so if there was an isolationist senator who had a mistress, the British would feed that item to Walter Winchell. If there was a British war hero that they wanted to get a lot of publicity for, they'd feed him that item too. They traded items on a regular basis. They fed an awful lot of items to them, destroying figures that were supportive of the Third Reich, like Charles Lindbergh and other prominent Americans that were, in the early days of the war, very anti-interventionist, in which the British wanted to see silenced. So this was a very cozy relationship between Roald Dahl and some of the premier members of the press. And when it came time to oust Wallace, many very embarrassing chapters in Wallace's past were dug up and fed to the press. Wallace had had one very unfortunate episode in his youth. He had become entranced by a Russian mystic who turned out to be quite a charlatan. And the British dug all this up and fed it to the press, and it made Wallace look rather foolish and rather cultish. It made him seem even more unreliable and flaky. There were a lot of Democrats that already didn't trust him. And in a very controversial and heated Republican convention, he was booted from the ticket. And the British, there's many memos and documents between British intelligence congratulating themselves on the ousting of Wallace in 1944. They were happy to get Truman as a replacement. So it's interesting to see how effective they thought they were. Historians can argue how much they got done, but it was an unprecedented level of alliance and manipulation when it comes to our press. And the press will tell you how objective and independent they are, but I think even now we have some sense that they always aren't as objective and independent as they pretend to be. And what's interesting about this is it's documented. This isn't people claiming. We have the documents going back and forth between Winchell and between Pearson and Dahl. And interestingly enough, Dahl, who wrote this section of the official British Secret Service report on the war, he says of himself, he became so close to Drew Pearson that Pearson regarded him as, quote unquote, one of the family. So that's quite indictment. Now, in addition to journalists, Dahl made incredible social headway. As I said, he was very charming. He became adopted by Washington's premier hostesses, and as I mentioned to some people during dinner, one of the premier hostesses was Evelyn Walsh McLean. She was actually very conservative. She was virulently anti-Roosevelt, anti-New Deal, anti-intervention, but she loved Dahl. And she invited him to all of her dinner parties, and her dinner parties were very famous in Washington. She had a huge mansion called Friendship. She had a bevy of servants, and she had all the most famous people there. And she loved Dahl because he would bring British celebrities like Noel Coward to her dinners, and she had no idea the two of them were taking notes, you know, in the loo when nobody was looking. And she would invite all of the cabinet officials, the Supreme Court justices, senators from both sides of the aisle. And if they got into a fight during dinner, so much the better. She loved the press. She loved the attention, and they were the place to be. So Dahl was mixing with very, very heady company. He became very good friend with Astor. He became good friends with Henry Morgenthau. He became a poker-playing buddy of Harry Truman. And we were talking about a 26-year-old air attaché who arrived in this country in 1942 penniless with no connections. So he was making tracks. Now, one of the things that Dahl was assigned to do as part of his cover story while he was in Washington was to write British propaganda. A lot of people did that in those days, and it was part of the war effort. You were fanning the flames of patriotism, and you were boosting people's sort of fighting spirit here and cheering them on. Remember, it was a war on two fronts. We were fighting the Japanese and the Germans, and the English were very concerned that the American hatred was focused on the Japanese after Pearl Harbor, and that we would send more planes and more money and more ammunition to the Pacific front. And they wanted to keep attention focused on the European war, and so that was part of the job of Roald Dahl, was to write about the heroics of the RAF officers, those daring young men, and keep people sending ships and planes to Europe. Well, he got very good at it, and his story started running in all the American magazines. It was straight PR. You've read it collected in some books now as short stories, but believe it or not, it was propaganda. It was probably assigned by the British ambassador, people in the British Information Services. It was vetted before it went out, but then it was published in places like the Saturday Evening Post and Collier's and Ladies' Home Journal. And one of these stories was a short story that he wrote, probably to arouse the sympathy of American housewives, and it was about little gremlins that haunted the engines of the RAF pilots and made them crash. And Eleanor Roosevelt read this story to her grandchildren and just loved it. And so she invited young Dahl to dinner at the White House. Well, she became entranced by him. One of her sons was a pilot, and he was away at war, and she missed her sons. They were all actually, by the early 40s, all four boys were in the service and away from home, and she felt the house was very quiet. So she started inviting Dahl to the White House for dinner all the time. Then she started inviting him to Hyde Park, the Roosevelt family retreat. What she didn't know was that Dahl was keeping notes and filing 12-page single-spaced intelligence reports back to William Stevenson, who would send them directly to Churchill. And these reports are absolutely fascinating. They've never been published before, and I include them in the book. And here you see a 26-year-old Dahl. He's an amateur spy, but he's quite observant. He's writing things like, he thinks Roosevelt's having an affair with Crown Princess Martha, and he describes why. He describes Roosevelt's health in great detail because he knows that Churchill's obsessed with Roosevelt's health. He sits and talks with Roosevelt about the war, and he conveys Roosevelt's thought about the progress of the war. And these are very, very detailed reports. And this was his way of conveying information, and it was information that Churchill could rely on rather than stuff he got from his State Department people or the embassy, which he often felt was processed and seen by too many eyes. And he liked these private reports. People like Dahl were known at the time. They were go-betweens, and they were called buffers. And their job was to sort of give him an informal back channel to the president. And in fact, Dahl, in one of his intelligence reports, states that he was fairly sure that FDR knew what he was up to, because by his later visits to Hyde Park, when he was alone with FDR, FDR would say, "Well, I wonder what Winnie thinks about this." And then he would try out some idea, and he was clearly, in his own way, telling Dahl, you know, send this back and get a reaction for me. And it was a way for them to try out various ideas through a back channel and not have to go through all the State Department stiffs. So it was quite an operation that the Irregulars had going. Now, one of the people, besides Eleanor Roosevelt, that Dahl charmed was one Claire Booth Luce. And hence the infamy that he has for his relationship as his reputation as a swordsman spy. He was at a British embassy dinner at this point. He had become quite a celebrated figure. People knew he was friends with the Roosevelts. He was getting a reputation as quite a young literary star. Believe it or not, that little short story, The Gremlins, was optioned by Walt Disney, who flew him to Burbank. And so Dahl was getting quite a reputation. So when Clare Boothe Luce made a pass at him at the British embassy one night, his bosses took him aside and said, "Go with it." Clare Boothe Luce was married to Henry Luce. Henry Luce was a Republican. He was extremely powerful, the owner and publisher of Time Life. He was very critical of Churchill and even more critical of Roosevelt. So his young blonde wife had run for Congress from Connecticut. She had just been elected, and believe it or not, she got herself put on some of the most important war boards. And so the British were obsessed with what the Luces were thinking, and the Luces were just on the top of the enemies list. So when Clare Boothe Luce took Roald Dahl back to her hotel suite for 3 days and didn't let him up for air, he finally went back to the embassy and said, "This is too much. You know, she's 13 years older than me, and I'm a young man, and this is above and beyond the call of duty." And he was told that immortal line, pretty much, you know, close your eyes and think of England. You didn't expect this tonight. Come on. One of my favorite parts of Roald Dahl's adventures in America really are based on a friendship he made here, and it was a friendship that made his name and his career, and we would none of us know Roald Dahl's name now if it wasn't for this gentleman. And his name was Charles Marsh. Charles Marsh was just an amazing self-made American. He was one of those great characters that came up from nothing, started as a paper boy, bought one newspaper, and ended up owning all of the newspapers in Texas, and newspaper chains running up and down from Texas all the way to New England. He owned Texas oil wells and Texas real estate, and he was the Prince of Austin in the 1930s and 1940s and one of the most powerful figures in Texas politics. And he was the making of a young congressman named Lyndon B. Johnson. Now, Charles Marsh was a super patriot, and he moved to Washington at the outbreak of the war to do what he could for the New Deal administration. And he set up a powerful think tank in a mansion in DuPont Circle, and he entertained all of the major figures in the administration in Roosevelt's so-called brain trust. And he was a member of the kitchen cabinet of Henry Wallace, and Wallace went to Marsh's house every day for drinks. So when Dahl started turning up and snooping around and being at his parties, Marsh very quickly scoped out what he was up to and said, "Look, I know you're a spy. You're not fooling anyone. And I'm on the same side you are. We're allies. We want the same thing. And I'm pro-British, and I'll do what I can for Churchill, and I'll do what I can for you, and you'll tell me what you're up to, and we'll go in this together." And they became the best of friends. They were both 6'6", by the way, so they were the few men that they knew that literally saw eye to eye. They became best friends and co-conspirators, and it would be a father-son relationship for the rest of their lives. And it was at Charles Marsh's DuPont Circle mansion that Dahl actually stole a very controversial document that Henry Wallace had drafted, and it was about the future of the airwaves. It was the commercial aviation. The Lend-Lease bill had established the right for America to build air bases all over England and the British colonies. This would be a way of giving them support. But of course, the British were smart enough to know that Pan Am, which had gotten the military contract, was in fact in it for their own advantage, and were already looking to lock up the European market post-war. It reminds you all, I think, that even a great war like World War II does come down to wallet issues at the end of the day. Even at the height of the war, the British were obsessed with the fact that America was going to emerge from the war the dominant power, dominate the world airways, and that the empire would be over. Dahl snuck into the bathroom, read this document, realized how important it was. It was Wallace's statement that England's empire had to end and that they should open the airwaves to international travel. He had it in mind immediately that this was something that Churchill had to see. He immediately phoned somebody from the Irregulars He hid in the bathroom until he thought they had arrived. He snuck out. He passed them the document. Those days you had to take it back to the office to be copied. And then he returned it without anyone knowing. It was that little bit of amateur sleuthing that actually got him hired full-time as a spy. And Charles Marsh probably never knew that his close friend and protege had betrayed him ever so slightly, since Charles Marsh was a great backer of Henry Wallace. But those were times of spies doing what they had to do for their country, of betraying friends and betraying confidences in the name of patriotism. It's an unscrupulous line of work, and it's not always very pretty, but it is important to know that they did it because they thought it was the right thing. It was doing the wrong thing for the right thing. The end justifies the means. Not everyone today, however, likes the way that looks on paper. As the war began to wind down, the history of the spies in America became more and more controversial. More State Department figures became aware of what they called a secret army in America, a shadow force run by Churchill, breaking the laws of the land. And everyone became concerned that if this became known to Congress, known to the American people, there would be congressional hearings and heads would roll. And so by the early months of 1945, the cover-up began and the recriminations. It was interesting enough that one of the problems that the British had in kicking out these spies, and people would say, well, why, if they didn't want them there, why didn't they just boot them out? Well, the problem was America, at the start of World War II, had no foreign intelligence service. We had such poor information. We relied on information entirely on our embassies and our allies, and we got the intelligence that we deserved. It may sound familiar to you at the start of the Iraqi war. We trusted our allies. We thought we were getting good intelligence, and we did not. But it was the only foreign intelligence we had. We were utterly dependent on the British for foreign intelligence and for how to go about gathering it. So much so that, in fact, several years into the war, Stevenson suggested that America start building its own sister agency to the Irregulars, to the British Security Coordination. And, in fact, Ian Fleming was brought over, and he worked for Stevenson. Stevenson's headquarters, by the way, were in Radio City in Rockefeller Center on the 34th floor. And he worked there closely with Stevenson and a man named General Donovan, who Stevenson suggested would be the perfect man to head this agency. And he wrote many of the key documents that were used to outline what this agency, to be called the OSS, would look like. The OSS would later morph into the CIA. So entangled was our relationship with these British spies that it was very difficult to root them out. But as soon as the war was over, the tide turned very quickly. There was a great sense of embarrassment that we as a country, and now we were emerging as a global power, as victories on two fronts, that we had been so dependent on the British, that we had allowed them to dominate our foreign policy, and that we had been a handmaiden to their policies. And so the British were very quickly weeded out of the OSS and booted out of the country. And ever since then, there has been a great covering up of these documents. The British have never released any of their official documents on the British Security Coordination. The main history that I cite, the so-called official history of the British Security Coordination from 1940 to 1945 that Dahl helped to write, in fact, has still not been declassified in Britain. It's been published here, though it says in small print on the front, without Her Majesty's permission. The rest of the documents, every 5 years, British journalists petition Parliament, and they go off and they think about it for a while, and then they come back and they say, we don't think so. So no one thinks that they'll ever be declassified. In terms of the documents here, in getting, for example, the FBI files of David Ogilvy and Dahl, they come, there's very little in them, much is blacked out, and it's quite clear that they've been ransacked, and we'll never know what was in the original files. But when it comes to this period of close collaboration between our two countries, I think that one of the lines that I'm most intrigued by was uttered by a lawyer named Ernest Cuneo. Ernest Cuneo was the go-between between British intelligence and the OSS and FDR's office. He was a member of FDR's brain trust. And he said, as devious as these guys were, they were on the side of the angels, as much as they were trying to trick us into the war and committing dirty tricks. They were our best friends. Of course the British were trying to push us into the war, he said. But then indeed we were a pushover. It reminds me of the line from Chaucer, "He fell upon her and would have raped her, but for her ready acquiescence." As a last observation, people often ask me, well, when you write these books about World War II, do you ever think about today, about these books' relevance for today? Well, I'd say that it's hard not to. History has an awful habit of repeating itself. And when you read this period of American history and you see how little foreign intelligence we had, how dependent we were on other countries for intelligence, and how much it cost us in some sense in lives in the early months of the war, and the fact that we entered that war very late, I think you realize that you cannot be a democracy and you cannot be a free people without a great intelligence agency, a strong intelligence agency, even though in some sense what they do is in violation of much of what a democracy stands for. But as we now are a country that finds itself at war, it's worth paying extremely close attention, not only to the role of our foreign intelligence, but our media and the influence of propagandists and the super lobbyists who would get us into these wars and keep us there.
Forget the name of the newspaper boy who became a millionaire.
Charles Marsh.
Correct. Can you explain? He was pro-British.
He was.
And yet he was close with Henry Wallace, who was anti-British Empire. Can you explain that relationship?
Well, he had, he was an early backer. He had, like a lot of newspaper tycoons, they like to have politicians in their pocket. He was a great early supporter of Lyndon Johnson, great aspirations for Lyndon Johnson. He thought Henry Wallace could be president. And he was a great supporter of Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace, as I said before, was a great Democrat in the sense that he was a big supporter of the farmers and the common man and lifting the poor. And this was what Charles Marsh, who had come from nothing and made his own fortune, was a great believer in. He did not share Henry Wallace's flakier religious beliefs. And he did not, oddly enough, detect, or he wasn't bothered by his more leftist leanings at that time. In this country, Henry Wallace would later run for president as part of the Progressive Party with communist backing. So he really sort of showed his true colors in 1948 when he ran for office. And Charles Marsh actually broke with him before that and never spoke to him again. But, in the late 30s and early 40s, he thought that Henry Wallace had the potential to sort of be a great man. And interestingly enough, Henry Wallace was also 6'5". And I swear to God, I think there's something to it. I mean, these three guys were just great friends, and Roald Dahl and Henry Wallace played tennis together. They all sort of saw each other every day, and they were great friends. And it's interesting because if it wasn't for Charles Marsh, Roald Dahl, as this young man, probably never would have had access to the Vice President of the United States, but as it was, they became very, very good friends. And he saw him on a daily basis at Charles Marsh's mansion because Charles Marsh was really a member of Wallace's kitchen cabinet. As a sidelight, I have to tell the story. Charles Marsh had an enormous mansion in Virginia, and he threw great parties there. And he was he sort of booted out his Texas wife, and he took up with this gorgeous young woman named Alice Glass. Alice Glass was one of the most beautiful women of her time, and she was 22 years younger than Charles Marsh, and she was his mistress for many years. And when he finally got his divorce, they married. Well. A very young but married Lyndon Johnson fell madly in love with Alice Glass at Charles Marsh's Virginia estate and began an affair that would last some 15 years. Robert Caro says that the affair went on into the early years of the Vietnam War. And he almost left his wife for Alice Glass, but he knew that it would be the end of his presidential chances. But the affair continued in secret for many years. But Alice Glass had 5 husbands, so I think he made a good choice. It was a lively period. That's why we World War II writers, we love this period. Are there any other questions?
My daughter's 6'2", so perhaps there is something. She couldn't make the lecture. Roald Dahl's her favorite author.
How old is she? It might have been a good thing. Oh, that's okay. All right.
What brought on the VFG and the dream catchers?
You know, it's a very complicated question, and I don't address it directly in my book because Roald Dahl has never addressed it directly. When asked in his later years, he would sort of demur and say, well, they're stories I told my grandchildren and my children. I think, obviously, it's much more complicated than that. My own feeling about it is, and you'll see if you read the book and the things that happened to him, he had more than one sort of nervous breakdown as a very young man. He saw just an enormous amount of death. I mean, if you know what RAF pilots went through, this was a horrendous thing to watch a company of young men die. I mean, you're talking about 21-year-old young men, and in those days, this was the cream of England's crop. These were wonderful young boys, and they died a horrific death. They often burned to death in their cockpits before the planes went down, and as your fellow pilots, you watched them die a terrible death. He did this over and over and over again before he crashed and burned himself. That's going to leave enormous scars on him, both physically and emotionally. He would have 9 surgeries in the next 15 years to try and correct the damage, and he was in pain for the rest of his life. So I think that he had a very, very dark view of humanity by the time he came through the war and was looking for ways in his fiction to escape it, to find another way of looking at the world. And I think perhaps in his adult fiction was very, very dark. It was very cruel. And I think perhaps in children's fiction he finally found an escape.
Matilda?
You know, it's difficult to say, though. I will tell you that some people think that Charlie and the Chocolate Factory was his relationship with Charles Marsh, this incredible, whimsical, unbelievably wealthy, maverick Texan who opened up to a very young and penniless Roald Dahl a world of wealth and opportunity that he could never have had without him.
This may be off topic just slightly, but in talking about Roosevelt with, wanting to support the British, I'm sure we've all heard the rumors that Pearl Harbor could have possibly been prevented. In doing all of your research on World War II, have you ever found anything to support that?
I haven't. I have to say I find it an annoying sort of conspiracy theory. You know, the nature of wartime intelligence is that you get a lot of it, and a lot of it's bad, and a lot of it's ignored. We had very bad radar. I did an entire book about radar. We had very primitive radar prior to Pearl Harbor. Our experts and our scientists had been begging the military to put money into radar, but there was no money being put into any war programs prior to Pearl Harbor. So we were way behind England and Germany in our development in many areas, and that was one of them. Various reports of Japanese intelligence reports came in about Japanese troop movements, about the movements of the Japanese fleet and the movement of Japanese planes. You know what? We translated well about 10% of each of those codes. The Japanese would change their codes. Then we wouldn't be able to translate anything for about 2 months. Then we'd break it. We'd get about 25% of each message. So that wasn't terribly good intelligence. And our defenses in Hawaii were very poor. Did we know that our naval stronghold was a target? Yes. We had all our ships there. Were we complacent and arrogant that we, as a country that had never been attacked, our landmass, U.S. soil, would not be attacked? We were. The Japanese were convinced that we were what they considered at that time a cowardly country, that we did not know how to fight. Remember, Europe had been at war for something like 6 years while we sat on our hands. The Japanese had surmised from that we were not a fighting country, that they would attack us, that we would recoil in horror, and that they would quickly lock up Hawaii and that whole part as part of their empire. And they made a terrible miscalculation. Any other questions?
I have a question from back here, if you don't mind. Claire Booth Luce, contrary to her name, was not a loose woman. And yet she threw herself over Roald Dahl and quite possibly, from what you're saying, senior members of Congress to get those appointments. Is there any backstory there you can share with us? Was she a double agent, maybe?
Well, you know, Claire Booth Luce, well, she's a very controversial figure. Actually, someone that I had dinner with today was quoting the Wall Street Journal review of the book where are you? Do you remember the line? Yes. Can you say the line?
It was not, something to the effect it was not
That she had a
seduced, and that was not particularly
surprising. I think that what the Wall Street Journal was ever so subtly suggesting was that Claire Booth Luce was actually known in Washington for being quite loose. In fact, there were lots and lots of headlines at the time, like loose thinking and loose behavior, and the spelling was different. She had quite a reputation. You know, she was married to a man much older than she was. She took up residence in a Washington hotel. He was working in New York at his publishing offices and had a house in Connecticut and rarely came to Washington or didn't come for long stretches. And she was known to entertain a good portion of Washington. She had a very close relationship with Bernard Baruch, the billionaire. She was a real character. So I think Roald Dahl was just one of her many conquests. I think it was her conquest, not his. Yeah. Any other questions? Well, thank you all so much for coming tonight.